One afternoon last fall, about a dozen first-year UC Berkeley students gathered in a classroom where math professor Zvezda Stankova held her office hours for help with calculus. But quickly, Zvezda realized some of them needed much more basic help.
So this is Calculus 2. We are studying some very complex integrals, series, differential equations. And while I am answering questions at that level, some students would show me a page of how they have solved a linear equation, like 7x minus 2 equals to 9. And such problems do appear in Calculus 2 as maybe the 19th out of 20 steps. So they certainly need to know how they can do this, but I wonder how they could even get to there if they are so far behind in this type of knowledge.
So she told everyone to stop what they were doing and watch. And she went through step by step how to solve the equation for x.
So literally, I was teaching with one hand complex integrals, and with the other hand, I was explaining how to write a solution to a simple linear equation that they should have learned in middle school.
Zvezda says she and many of her colleagues have seen more and more students in recent years who are unprepared for college-level math, which makes it harder to teach all students.
We do manage to attract very capable, fantastically smart and motivated students. And we end up trying to teach both ends at the same time, which means we teach no one well. You essentially end up with two different classes sharing the same physical space. Those who are ready to fly and a remedial class in math. How do you teach both?
This is Education Beat, getting to the heart of California schools. I'm Zaidee Stavely. This week, should UC again require the SAT or ACT for admissions? Many faculty agree that in recent years, students seem to be arriving in college less well prepared than before. Where they disagree is on the solution. Zvezda Stankova and 4 other UC professors wrote an open letter to the UC calling to reinstate standardized tests like the SAT and ACT as an admissions requirement for freshman applicants. More than 2,000 University of California faculty from science, math, technology, and engineering programs signed it. But not all faculty agree. Bjorn Birnir was one of 2 UC math department chairs who opted not to sign the open letter. Bjorn teaches math at UC Santa Barbara, and he discussed the issue with his department's undergraduate committee.
There was not universal agreement. Some people were for it, some were against it. But in the end, the majority thought that even though there was a problem, and everybody acknowledges that, this would not be the way to address it.
He says requiring the SAT or ACT for admissions will not fix the problem, but instead, it might exclude some students from getting the opportunity for a college education.
What they probably would do is that they would exclude some people who could come in, maybe just be successful in the calculus course if they pass the exam, or if not, get the remedial education that they need and then be successful. But they would be excluded to begin with and never have that opportunity.
My colleague Michael Burke has been covering this controversy for EdSource. Hi, Michael.
Hi, Zaidee.
So when the UC decided to stop using the SAT for admissions, they did that for a reason, right? Can you talk about what went into that decision and what the reasons were behind it?
So initially, they paused it because of the pandemic. And then, a few months later, they just decided that they were going to suspend it for good. And, there were various lawsuits prior to the decision too, arguing that the tests were not equitable. So there were and still are a lot of critics and people who believe that the tests are biased, essentially in favor of affluent students who can afford, expensive test prep or might go to high schools where they just get prep as opposed to low-income students who don't have access to those things. And so it was really kind of an equity decision.
And was that based on statistics or data?
So there has been a lot of research into this. I don't know specifically like what research they use, but one of the more prominent researchers on this subject is Saul Geiser at UC Berkeley, who's still actually doing research and just had a paper, I believe, last year. But his research, which was before the decision, showed that basically the predictive value of the tests had declined over time since UC had gone to what they call kind of holistic admissions, where they're looking at a whole bunch of factors, not just test scores and GPAs. So that was one thing. And then kind of the bigger part of his report was that the socioeconomic background of each student had a significant impact on their test scores. So basically, they were pretty much a huge barrier to students, depending on a student's family income, their parents' education, and also their race and ethnicity. So a student who's low income, a student who's Black or Latino, or whose parents, maybe never went to college, were at a big disadvantage as compared to, students on the opposite end of those spectrums.
Okay, so UC dropped the SAT, and so did several other colleges and universities across the country, including some Ivy Leagues. But then professors started noticing more and more students arriving unprepared. Some of them think that the lack of an entrance exam like the SAT is the reason for that. What are some other possible explanations you're hearing?
What faculty and other people that I've talked to have speculated is it could just be sort of a lingering effect of the pandemic, for one, but also just students relying on AI a lot when they're in high school and also kind of relatedly maybe spending a lot of time on social media and just not having the same attention spans as maybe previous generations did.
So now many of those universities that had stopped requiring the SAT for admissions have now brought it back. Why did they do that?
I think the biggest reason they've brought it back, and the reason that there's kind of a push to get UC to bring it back, is there's this belief that students are less prepared, and that in admissions there's not an objective measure that the test score previously represented, or at least that's how it's seen. And so they can't really, in admissions, judge who's ready for college and who's not ready as well as maybe they could before, or at least that's the argument. Another reason I've heard faculty kind of push to bring back the SAT is because they feel like the essays that students write for college, which have always kind of been part of the admissions process, obviously, that they can't trust that students are actually writing their own essays because of AI. So that's kind of thrown another wrench into things. And then also they talk about grade inflation, so they can't trust the GPA. So they just feel like they don't have a good measure of preparedness, and that the SAT maybe could be more of an objective measure.
Here's how Zvezda Stankova explains it.
The GPAs from high school, there is a tremendous amount of cheating. We know it in college. I have dealt with that. My colleagues have dealt with it at a level that is unprecedented. So homeworks, quizzes, exams, and ultimately high school grades. How much can we trust them? So we've got the essays written by AI. What is left as an objective measure? Extracurriculum activities? Well, those are even more so tied to the inequities in our society. So we need a baseline check, which is the SAT.
So, Michael, we heard from Bjorn Birnir earlier. Do you know how many STEM faculty agree with him and are against reinstating the SAT as a requirement for admissions?
I don't know the percentages, but it's definitely not unanimous. I believe by now there's been over 2,300 who have signed the STEM letter, but there's a lot more than that in terms of the total STEM faculty at UC. So it's definitely not unanimous, and I've interviewed STEM faculty who are not in favor of bringing it back, but there is definitely a vocal group of faculty who feel strongly that it should come back.
And what about faculty in humanities and social sciences? Do you have a sense of how they are feeling about how students are prepared?
Yeah, there was a separate letter from social sciences and humanities faculty calling for the same thing. Again, I don't think it's anywhere close to unanimous, but there is also a feeling among some of those faculty that I've talked to that students similarly are not prepared. Obviously, they're not taking calculus, but the examples I've heard is just not being able to do reading assignments, things like that.
Can you share a little bit of the arguments of those who are against bringing back the SAT? What are they arguing?
They're not arguing against the point that fewer students are prepared. I think they're just skeptical that getting rid of the SAT was the reason for that. And they just still believe that the SAT and the ACT are not equitable and they're not going to be basically a fair tool to use in admissions. And they also kind of feel like the problem is a bit overstated. So there was this report from UC San Diego that had a lot of like eye-popping, sort of jarring headlines that came out of it and points about increased levels of students not being prepared. And one of the things that was in the report was that the number of students that were placed into one of UC San Diego's lowest math courses when they were entering as freshmen increased from 490 to 916 students. So it almost doubled. But there were some other things that could explain that rather than just students not being prepared. I think the biggest one was that they changed the criteria for how they decided to place students into the higher levels of math. So many students who had previously been placed into maybe the third lowest level were now being placed into one of the two lowest levels. And then there's also the argument that I've heard that these are public universities, the UCs. So even if students are less prepared, that as a public university, UC sort of has some type of obligation to help prepare these students. And I think there's just this idea that, the UCs, rather than just denying these students, should just help them essentially get prepared for college level math once they're in.
Bjorn Birnir says instead of reinstating the SAT, high schools and UC campuses should be preparing students better.
I think the math education in high school has to be improved, especially nowadays, where a lot of things that people have to do depends on mathematics. A lot of the data science and the AI, and it really helps if you know some mathematics. In particular, algebra has to be made accessible and part of the basic math education of everybody. Not everybody has to know calculus, but the closer you can bring people to understanding calculus in high school, the better.
His campus, UC Santa Barbara, has all newly admitted STEM students take a placement exam.
And if they're not prepared well enough, then we send them to the local community college, where they take remedial courses. And then, when they're done with those, they come back and take the test again. And almost invariably, they pass the test and do well in the calculus course.
Zvezda, though, says no amount of summer community college courses is going to help students who are so far behind they can't do linear equations like the one her students struggled with during office hours.
Let's say you get a student who is at the middle school math level, and we have quite a lot from these diagnostics. What are they going to do over the summer? Where are they going to go and catch up? The suggestion is put them in a pre-calculus course in community colleges. Why pre-calculus? Because there is nothing lower than pre-calculus. Community colleges are not offering any more remedial math. So how much are they going to catch up? Because we are talking about years. We're not talking about several weeks of a catch-up summer school. If we ignore the fact that the student is so far behind that they are going to struggle, then we are putting a blindfold on our eyes. And currently, from all top universities in the United States, only University of California is test blind.
Patricia Gandara was a member of the faculty committee charged in 2019 with reviewing the UC policy on the use of SAT and ACT in admissions. She wrote a commentary for EdSource against reinstating the tests. She writes that students in less privileged communities often receive weaker instruction in math and other subjects at their high schools. And when UC eliminated the use of SAT and ACT in admissions, that encouraged more low-income Black and Latino students to apply. If we reinstate it, she says, proportionately fewer low-income Black and Latino students will be admitted. She also says the SAT doesn't give the UC specific enough data about which skills students have and which they need more help with. She advocates instead for a test that measures skills and knowledge needed to be successful in STEM. And then she says students could either take supplemental courses or opt out of STEM. Zvezda Stankova agrees equity is a priority, and there are inequalities among high schools. But she says she doesn't believe that the SAT is less equitable than other measures.
SAT is just a thermometer that is capturing the biases in our society, just like any other metric. What is important to understand is that SAT must be used in a holistic review as one baseline check, not as a determining factor. It has to be taken in a holistic review, just like what was happening before 2020.
She says rather than creating further barriers for students from less privileged backgrounds, reinstating the SAT could help UC decide which students from under-resourced schools to admit.
You take two kids from the same under-resourced school, and they have similar GPA and great essays and don't have much extracurricular activities because they cannot pay for them. How are you going to distinguish between them? You don't. We don't have an actual objective measure to say who of those two kids has the potential. That's the problem. We can adjust per school. We can try to take students from under-resourced schools, but do we know who is who? So it becomes a complete lottery. So the SAT, what it will do is it will give admissions a way to distinguish between students within the same school. That's what we have been saying all along.
Michael, are there other options on the table in addition to bringing back the SAT or leaving it out of admissions entirely?
There is this other group of people who are kind of, I guess, in the middle, who are hoping that UC will consider using the Smarter Balanced exam, which is the state test given to students in grades 3 through 8, and then also in 11th grade. And there's a belief that maybe that test could be somewhat more equitable because it's aligned with curriculum. It's designed to measure college readiness.
When will UC make the decision, Michael?
So the timeline has changed a few times, actually, but the latest is that the Board of Admissions and Relations with Schools, which is a UC Academics Senate committee, which oversees admissions matters, they are going to be studying this, looking at kind of the pros and cons, and they're going to come up with a report by February of next year. And then they're going to deliver recommendations to the Board of Regents, which is sort of the ultimate decision maker, obviously, by June. UC's official stance is that it's not happening for fall 2027. They're not sure yet whether there will be any difference for fall 2028.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Zaidee. It's an honor to be on the podcast.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Education Beat, getting to the heart of California schools, a production of EdSource. You can find a link to Michael's story in our podcast notes and at edsource.org. Our producer is Coby McDonald. Special thanks to our guests, Zvezda Stankova and Bjorn Birnir, and reporter Michael Burke. Thanks also to editor-at-large John Fensterwald. Our theme music is from Blue Dot Sessions. This episode was brought to you by the College Futures Foundation. I'm Zaidee Stavely. Join us next week and subscribe so you won't miss an episode.